Chris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War. I'm getting ready to do a podcast episode with one of our newest members, Devan Sommerville. And as we were talking about the Trans Mississippi, he brought in a fascinating character that I think we all know from the Battle of Newmarket, Franz Sigel. And Sigel had a pretty prominent role as an artillerist, as in his many other capacities, but he had a pretty interesting artillery role in the Trans Mississippi. Devin, why should we be surprised that Franz Sigel is running a cannon?
Well, we probably shouldn't be surprised that he is that was his military training. When you go back to his role in the German states, I believe, I may be paraphrasing here, I believe he was served in the army of the Grand Duchy of Baden. And anyone can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on the state there, but was very involved, of course, in the 1848 revolutions, and he had been in the artillery. So he was trained as an artilleryman. That was his discipline as a soldier. And then, of course, came to the United States after those revolutions. Very early on, had a very strong leadership role in the German community in St. Louis. I believe he was the commissioner of public schools there, or superintendent of schools there. And he very quickly became involved with raising forces for the Union in that city, and thus was promoted into more senior roles with unfortunate results, perhaps, to the larger campaigns in the Trans-Mississippi and elsewhere. But he did manage to accomplish some very impressive feats, specifically with artillery in the Trans-Mississippi early in the war that stood among the more remarkable ones of the entirety of the conflict. At Wilson's Creek, his had been the plan to divide the federal force and attack the Confederates along Wilson's Creek from two directions, an inferior force dividing itself in front of a larger one. But the success in the South and in capturing the Confederates by surprise through his attack was in large part achieved by his sighting and oversight of the artillery battery with him, which he had helped raise, Backoff's battery from St. Louis, and had the effect, particularly against inexperienced forces, of completely disrupting the Missouri State Guard and Arkansas cavalry who were camped in the fields south of the creek, or in the south end of the battlefield in the area called Sharp's Fields and Sharp's Farm. And it was because of Sigel's personal management of the artillery and the sighting of guns that it led to that outcome. The battle would ultimately go in a poor direction for Sigel, which would lead to a lot of discredit for him amongst the Union forces in Missouri. But he would remain in command, an important command in Missouri, and would have another opportunity to show his artillery prowess at the Battle of Pea Ridge. In the first day of the Battle of Pea Ridge, he had largely been away from the field, had been maintaining the federal rear guard as it was along the trench lines they had at the Little Sugar Creek. But he brought his force back to the main army for the second day's fight. And prior to that, had worked with a number of other Union commanders under the oversight of Samuel Curtis to array the federal artillery in such a way to begin a bombardment of the Confederate forces the next day. The artillery of the Confederates, by contrast, was very poorly sighted. Most of it was parked in camp around the Elkhorn Tavern, the famous building on the Pea Ridge battlefield that many of us have seen in photographs or paintings. But then it was again, Sigel was off his horse, standing behind the cannons, sighting where he wanted the cannons to specifically fire to break up that Confederate formation. And the descriptions of the effect of the artillery fire that the Federals launched, it was a quite a large barrage, and would have been one of the largest in North America up to that point in the war, was frightening. There was an area that was, large rock formations where many of the Confederate forces, the Missouri State Guard, were positioned, and it caused tremendous disruption and casualties, fragmenting these rocks, exponentially magnifying the impact. He was overseeing the batteries that the Confederates did bring into battery and into counter battery fire, breaking them up, forcing them to retreat. Many would go on to say that it was his finest day of the entire war. because effectively it was one of the few times in the entire conflict that artillery alone completely broke the enemy's line, this being the Confederates, and forced them to retreat. The Confederate supply position was already very tenuous because of poor management of the logistics. And functionally speaking, they couldn't keep the men together any longer. It forced the retreat, and thus the charge of the infantry of the Union force encountered very little resistance from the Confederates. It was largely the artillery that accelerated their retreat from Pea Ridge and won a strategic Union victory that affected the course of the theater for the rest of the war.
Then, of course, Siegel gets himself transferred to the east. We know him here for his work at Cedar Mountain, certainly as part of the Newmarket battle. Maybe does not do quite so well in those instances, but you give us reason to maybe think that it's worth taking a look at his early career if we want to be surprised.
It could be a good example of the Peter principle. He might have made a fabulous battery commander. Perhaps he was promoted above his strongest competencies.
So, we're going to hear our full interview with Devan coming up in the future episode of the Emerging Civil War podcast. Please be sure to stay tuned for that. Devan, thanks for taking a second to share the artillery adventures of Franz Sigel with us.
Thank you again.
I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.